The Lord be with you. It's good to see you this morning. Our scripture text today is in the Gospel of Matthew in chapter 26. While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived, and with him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one that I kiss is the man. Arrest him. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and he kissed him. And Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." And then the men stepped forward. They seized Jesus and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword, drew it, and he struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." And then all the disciples deserted him and fled. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Did you hear what happened up in the Grove last night? There are a bunch of men up there camping out, apparently, and this group of thugs that was hired by the religious leaders came up there, and there was commotion and loud voices. I hear somebody got their ear cut off. And then they kidnapped the one man, and they took him back off to where the religious leaders were, and then the rest of them just ran as fast as they could through the groves. It happened late at night. That kind of thing doesn't normally happen in this neighborhood. You know, last week we looked at Jesus praying with his disciples and telling them that, you know, to watch and be prepared to be able to face temptation. And as soon as he finished praying, he said, "Go ahead and get up now, my betrayer is here." And so the quiet of that time was broken by the sound of a large crowd of men marching into the place where they were. Now Matthew says it was a large crowd. You know, I always wondered about that crowd. Who was that crowd? Well, I mean, were they Roman soldiers? Were they the security guard at the temple? Who exactly were these people? Well, the truth is they were neither of those. They were not a legitimate law enforcement group. They were corrupt. The corrupt first century Jewish religious leaders often hired thugs to go out and do their bidding. There's a Jewish historian from the first century named Josephus. And we get a lot of information about what went on from outside the Bible from him because he lived during the first century and wrote about what was happening. Listen to what Josephus wrote about the high priest. "But Ananias had servants who were utter rascals, who, combining operations with the most reckless men, would go to the threshing floors and take by force the tithe of the priests, nor did they refrain from beating those who refused to give." Now that is an effective stewardship campaign right there. If you fall behind in your tithe, expect a visit from our stewardship committee. Tommy the knife and Sammy the bull will see you, and they will make you an offer you can't refuse. So these were just some thugs that the chief priest had hired to go out and do their bidding. And leading this crowd of thugs was one of Jesus' disciples, Judas. And Judas told them that apparently they didn't know which one was Jesus. So he said, "The one that I kiss," which in the Middle East, both then and today, that's a form of greeting. That's why he'd greet one another. So he told them, the one that I kiss, that's the one. Arrest him. And so Judas approached Jesus and he said, "Greetings, Rabbi," which is kind of interesting because in Matthew's gospel, Jesus doesn't really approve of the use of being called rabbi. And then Judas kissed him. That was the sign. Kissed him on the cheek. This is the one. Arrest him. It's bad enough to be betrayed, but to be betrayed with the sign of friendship. And so some men in the crowd walked forward and they grabbed Jesus. And when they did, everything broke loose. And one of Jesus' disciples, not knowing what else to do, took out a sword and cut off the ear of one of the people who was in the crowd. Testosterone was flowing and things were getting heated. And he did what most of us tend to do when we are threatened or frightened. He lashed out in violence. And Matthew doesn't give us a lot of details, but John tells us that it was Peter who brandished the sword. Luke tells us it was the right ear of the servant that was cut off. Now, this has nothing to do with anything important. It's just I find it interesting. It's possible that if the person's over here, you could cut off their right ear with a sword. But if you're facing the person, to cut off their right ear with a sword means you have to be left-handed. And so it led to a lot of speculation from people who believe that maybe, Peter may have been a southpaw. So, who knows? But Jesus ended the escalation by immediately telling him to put the sword away. No matter how real the danger was, and it was real because they were going to take Jesus away and kill him, he told his followers not to use violence to defend him. That is important for us to remember. Violence is never the way of Jesus. And so I want to go ahead and say this and make sure everybody understands we're on the same level. My sermons are scheduled way out in advance. I can tell you what I'm going to preach in June. So this text was scheduled for this Sunday months ago, way before the war in Iran or conflict or whatever we're going to call it ever started. And in this text, Jesus calls us to think about the choices that we make. When do we use power and when do we use restraint? So I just want to be very clear. This is no kind of underhanded, passive-aggressive comment on what's going on. But I'm not going to not talk about it either because we need to. Because we live in a culture that says get all the power you can and use it every time you can. If you use restraint, you're a coward and you're weak. And so we need the one place to hear the opposite of that, which is in the Gospels. And if we don't talk about it here, you're not going to hear it anywhere else. So this morning, that's what this is about. It's about all of us. We have these choices, whether it's from a national level right down to our personal lives. We often choose between whether to use power or whether to use restraint. And that's what is in the very gist of this story is about. And that's what I want us to hear. One of the reasons Jesus didn't need his followers using violence to defend him is because he didn't need them to defend him. And that's still true. Jesus doesn't need us to defend him. He said if he wanted to be defended, he could call more than 12 legions of angels to defend him. Now, a legion is 6,000 soldiers. I'm no math major, but I believe that's 72,000 angels. I have read that special operations units are normally deployed in groups of 12 or less. We're talking 72,000 angels who are ready and willing to go all Jason Bourne on this group of thugs. So when you put it in that perspective, do you see how silly Peter is with his little sword standing there? Jesus says, I don't really need that. It reminded me once in a church I was in, once we had a special Sunday. We were building a new building. And we had done a building campaign, and it was the Sunday where people were to bring their first gifts and their pledges to go toward the new building. And I realized that Sunday we were going to have a few $100,000 in the offering plate. So we contacted the local police chief, and he had some police cars sitting in front of the church, and we had police officers there on the outside. But one of the guys helping do the offering apparently didn't know that. And when he realized how much money was being collected, he got nervous. And as he walked by the pew, he picked up a sharpened pencil out of the pew. And he carried it around with him. And so after the offering was collected and everything, he kept the pencil. And when the service was over, I saw him. His name was Ed. And I said, Ed, what are you doing with that pencil? And he said, well, I was just worried when I saw how much money we were collecting. And I said, Ed, don't worry, it's covered. We have people here, it's all right. Everything's taken care of. And you can put the pencil down. Every time I read this story of Peter and his sword, I think about Ed and his pencil. So, he could have. That's the phrase that gets our attention. He could have called 12 legions of angels. So why didn't he? That's the part that's hard for us to understand. Because Jesus doesn't handle things the way we do. Earlier in the book of Matthew, Jesus said, love your enemy. Turn the other cheek. And the honest truth is we don't like that. We're not good at that. We don't know what to do with that because we want to get even. Recently, I heard somebody say that loving your enemies and turning the other cheek just won't work in the real world. Well, I want to tell you that person is wrong. And when somebody says that, they are directly contradicting Jesus, who told us something different. That's a false tribal narrative that we've adopted and we've accepted as true. But it isn't true. If violence and revenge brought lasting peace, folks, we would be drowning in peace by now, wouldn't we? But we're not, because it doesn't work. And I don't trust people who think they know more than Jesus. Because Jesus lived in the real world. Jesus died in the real world. Jesus created the real world, so I assume he knows how it would work if we were to actually give it a chance. And so as followers of Jesus, we have to decide, as we always do, to believe our tribal narratives that we're comfortable with or what Jesus said. Violence and vengeance are part of that tribal narrative we cling to when over and over again they've proven to be a false solution. But Jesus practices what he preached. We're so used to violence being the answer, we think it's the correct answer. And because we use it all the time. And here's the truth we don't say out loud. We wish Jesus sometimes would just stand up and fight. When is he going to stand up and fight? You remember when he was born, the wise men went to see him, and Herod found out where he was, or the general area, and Herod wanted to kill him, and so Herod killed infants looking for Jesus. And what did Jesus' family do? They left town, went to Egypt. He killed infants. Why didn't somebody stand up and fight? And after a couple of years, they moved back to Bethlehem, but there was a guy in charge now named Archelaus who was more violent than Herod. And so you know what they did? They slipped off to a little town called Nazareth out of the way where they wouldn't find him. Why didn't somebody stay there and fight? And he began his ministry in Galilee. But then John the Baptist was beheaded. And you know what Jesus did when they murdered John? He went back to Nazareth, gathered his stuff, and moved to Capernaum. They killed John. Why didn't he stay and fight? And then when the plot got out that they were trying to kill him, you know what he did? He left. Went to another place. Why didn't he stay and fight? I assume he could have called 12 legions of angels at any time. He could have, but he didn't. What about when they were nailing him to the cross? You know, that would have been a good time, I would think. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, Jesus embarrasses us. When is he going to quit running away and stand up and fight? When is he going to draw a line in the sand and say, enough? Enough. He could have, but he didn't. Because the character of God is not just power, but the character of God is the ability to know when to restrain that power. And in order for everything to take place that needed to take place, Jesus had to show restraint, not power. And so for our sakes, he showed restraint. In the James Bond movie Skyfall, there's this wonderful exchange between James Bond and Q. I wish I could do this in a proper British accent for you, but I can't. I'm just going to do it in Alabama. But here's the dialogue. If we can go to that first slide of Q. Q says, well, I hazard I can do more damage on my laptop sitting in my pajamas before my first cup of Earl Grey than you can do in a year in the field. And Bond's answer, so why do you need me? And Q says, every now and then a trigger has to be pulled. And Bond says, or not pulled. It's hard to know which in your pajamas. You see, there's a time for power. There is. And there's a time for restraint. I think of 4 young black men in North Carolina at a counter while people surrounded them and called them all kinds of names, dragged them off their stools and threw them on the floor. And they chose restraint. I think of the march in Selma, where peaceful protesters were beaten, and they chose restraint. I think about the march in Birmingham, where they turned dogs and fire hoses on children who were protesting, and they showed restraint. And in their restraint was the power to begin a change that would change a nation. And Jesus' restraint was the power to bring salvation to all of us. It takes character and it takes strength to show restraint. In our culture, we're taught the opposite. We're taught if we have any power at all, use it. Use it for our advantage. Power in the workplace flow chart, power in family dynamics, power in influence. Always use your power to get what you want. Our culture teaches us the love of power. But Jesus, in his restraint, has taught us the power of love. See, I learned this as a parent. You know, there are times when one of my children did something they shouldn't have done. And so I would use my power as a parent to make them change their behavior and apologize. There were other times, though, when you just looked in the face and you could see that they understood what they did was wrong and they were sorry. They got it. They didn't need me to do anything or say anything. They understood. And you know, when I look back on my parenting mistakes, I didn't use restraint enough. I didn't realize what an incredible option that could be. They grabbed Jesus by each arm to take him away. And the disciples turned and ran for their lives. And Matthew at least still calls them disciples. Mark doesn't call them disciples anymore at this point. But whatever you call them, you can color them gone. We live in a world where we struggle for all the power we can get and use it every chance we get. Jesus has all the power in the universe, and he chose restraint. And his restraint led to our salvation. And sometimes restraint is the most powerful tool that we have. It's a hard lesson for us to learn, because bullying and punishing and using violence to get our way, it never works in the real world. It's a short-term solution. But having the character to show restraint, character to love our enemies and not get even, that is what changes the world for good. The disciples would have done something if they could, but they couldn't. Jesus could have done something if he would, but he wouldn't. Did you hear what happened up in a grove last night? That kind of thing doesn't normally happen in this neighborhood.